Risks. Control Risks is an international business risk consultancy. We're not a technology company. We do leverage technology and use technology in our solutions for our clients. We've been around for 42 years and in India for the past 10 with a permanent physical presence in Delhi and Mumbai. What I'm going to talk through today is the way we use data analytics in fraud and corruption investigations specifically. Obviously off to a good start when the technology isn't working at the very beginning. This is basically going to what I was just saying. Offices throughout the region, 37 offices, not the 36 it actually says up there, around the world. Before I begin, I said I'm a political scientist. I also came out of law enforcement in Australia, where I worked for close to a decade. Would anyone like to guess what year, and I'm not going to get offended by the answers, I was first exposed to data analytics in a primitive form? Anyone? More than 10, I'll say that much. But good start, thank you. I really like you. Right, thank you. The first time I was exposed to data analytics was 2003, in a very primitive form of taking call charge records associated with a group of people engaged in armed robberies in New South Wales, Australia, cleansing the data, putting it through an automated tool for the purposes of visualizing the connections between all of these people. Looking back on it now, as we look at tools like Tableau and Periscope and everything else, it was not very advanced. I felt pretty cool doing it at the time, but these days, obviously, it doesn't stand up so much and it was hardly big data. So we're going to talk a little bit today to what is data analytics. I'm not going to go into detail on that because I am of the presumption that just about everyone here knows more about it than I do. And I'm going to talk to how we use data analytics in the detection of fraud, corruption, more broadly misconduct in an organization, because it is more broad than just fraud and corruption. But fundamentally, coming back to fraud, and at a simple level, obtaining benefit by deception, and how data analytics has changed the way that we go about detecting that sort of misconduct. So let's talk about the data. I mean, can't do much analytics of data without actually having some of it to begin with, right? This has changed so much since that first lot of material I looked at in 2003. It has grown exponentially. There are now more bits of data created than there are stars visible in the sky. More data has been created over the past 2 years than at any time through human history, which is just incredible. And there is approximately 1.7 megabit of data created every second for every person in the world, which is also pretty incredible. From the number of people I've seen taking photos today, the people in this room are skewing the averages. So it is a truly impressive set of statistics. What we're focusing on right now of the what is data analytics, and thank you Google, we've stolen your definition, is the fraud side, the small word right there. But all of these words in this word cloud apply to what I imagine most of you in this room are either interested in or are doing in your day-to-day work in analytics. The idea here being that we take the raw data that is relevant to misconduct, structured and unstructured, with a view to analyzing it to find out more information as investigators to help our clients answer the question of what has occurred. I use a very basic system for investigations: who, what, when, where, why, how. It's not the most complex methodology, but it stood me in good stead over the past couple of decades. And this sort of data helps me to answer those questions. Who is connected to whom? When did they meet? Where are they doing what they're doing? How are they doing it? What amount of money has gone missing? All of these questions can be answered with data analytics assisting, helping to leverage the technology and data to answer those questions in an easier manner. So what types of analytics are we using for these sorts of investigations? I didn't realize I have a counter there. This is the sort of stuff that we're looking at. Text sentiment analysis, looking at the content of material written to see what is behind it. One of the examples many people have seen of this is the social media analysis of the riots in the United Kingdom a few years ago, where they were able to show on a map where riots were likely to break out via text sentiment over Twitter and other social media platforms through the increase of aggression, aggressive use of terminology. Those helped to predict those hotspots on a map with reasonable accuracy, as I recall from looking at it. Looking at things like social network analysis, I made that comment before, who is connected to who? There is a wealth of that information available. One of the best tools for an investigator that's come to pass is social networking. I don't need to actually investigate people as heavily anymore. They post it all for me online. I know who's connected to who because they make friends with them. I know what they're doing because they post it online. I know where they're going to be because they've said they're attending an event at 4 o'clock this afternoon. All of that's now on the internet, often publicly available. Through analyzing it, we can actually then visualize those connections. Everyone is connected to this person. Person A is connected to person B, is connected to person C. Very helpful in figuring out how someone might know someone else, how they may be connected to a vendor that's engaged in collusion, how they might be using a third party who may or may not even exist to commit fraud. All of this can be very helpful material. Data visualization, it's relatively basic, but I mean, hands up in this room, who needs to create visual representations of data for any purpose in their organization? Yeah, I figured it would be a fair few. It's just as useful for investigations or more broadly for my organization, showing particularly senior executives risk insights. So what are the potential impacts to people, finances, reputation when they're looking at their data? I can come back to that a bit later on. Keyword analysis, very basic, but looking at the occurrences of keywords for things such as going through unstructured emails and communications. Rule-based red flag analysis. A few years ago, that would have been further up in complexity and so on, but you know, $0 transactions or 0-digit ending transactions, weekend invoicing remains an issue. Care of invoices, invoices from parties not present on a vendor master file, those 90-odd tests that most people run for looking at these red flags in your data. These are just some of the areas that can be used in fraud and corruption analysis. More broadly, as I said, in risk analysis, but I'm just focusing at the moment on those two areas. I'm going to go through primarily case studies from here on out, and I'm going to leave a reasonable amount of time at the end for people to ask questions as well. So you are welcome to butt in at any time, but I will also try and leave some time for everyone to ask those questions. So I've got a few examples here, and I might use more than one example for one slide, because many of these have similar bases across different matters. But the most kind of basic layout of the flow of our approach to data analytics at Control Risks is just here. We pull that data together, we examine it, we run any tests and models, and then we visualize it. It's not complicated particularly. It gets complicated when you're talking about the sets of data that you're dealing with, the types of information you're dealing with. But it is a really interesting way of being able to then look at that information in line with other more traditional techniques. Despite what CSI has had us believe on television for the past couple of decades, I don't think I've ever walked into an interview and have someone immediately break down and confess to committing fraud or any other offense. Fortunately, it doesn't work that way in my experience. But at the same time, having the data to present to them when you get to that interview can lead to them saying, yeah, all right, you did get me. I have walked into an interview with an individual who said, I have never committed fraud against my organization. Sure. Here's a payment approval form that says that you signed off on this payment to a non-existent vendor. Yes, that's definitely my signature, but that vendor existed. How do you know? Well, I saw them in the vendor master file. Okay. And here's the vendor creation document. Interestingly, you signed it and submitted it. Yes, I did. You did that a week before the payment was made. Yes. Okay. So you created it and you made the payment. So where's the proof of the services? Oh, it would be in my email somewhere. Okay, not a problem. Here's the results of searching your email for that vendor. Other than the creation and the payment, there's nothing in there. Oh, yeah, all right, I committed fraud. Those weren't quite the words and there was a bit more profanity involved. But this is the sort of stuff that it just helps the investigator to bring it all together. On its own, it doesn't answer all the questions. On its own, and I'll come to a false red flag down the line, it doesn't always give you all the answers, but it's just that extra tool in the arsenal, which for someone who's been doing investigations for a lot longer than my photo would suggest, thank you Photoshop, it is actually a major point in the arsenal, so it's a big advantage there. So a red flag analysis. We're all familiar with the concept of a working week, 5 days, 6 days. One of the big red flags we've seen over the past few years, and I've seen it in everything from very minor frauds to multi-million-dollar frauds of major organizations, has been the old invoices on the weekend trick. Someone who is engaged in accounts payable, who's colluding or directly involved, making sure those invoices get into the system on a weekend when no one's watching, might be able to get them into the queue at a point when they'll be backlogged and get approved, whatever the case may be. In this instance, and this is actually material out of a specific case, but it applies more broadly to my point, you can see an invoice date analysis at the top here that clearly shows that a number of invoices are getting inserted on a Saturday and Sunday. But then you see the approval dates and you can see nothing's being approved except Monday to Friday, right? This is my point to some extent around false red flags. This could be a problem. I acknowledge that. It could be a problem. It could be what I was saying, sneaking them through on the weekend for the purposes of getting around the invoicing processes, getting false invoices in. However, there is also the point here that actually none of those invoices are being approved on the weekend. So it is a red flag to examine. It may be a red flag that can be disproved and discarded down the line. So it becomes an assumption we can further test to see is it a fact and is it a concern. This came up not that long ago for a large company in Hong Kong where they had an employee, very well trusted, very well regarded financial employee, had worked for them for not much shy of 20 years and did almost all the invoicing. And she was a superb employee. They sat down and they explained to me that she never missed a day of work. She always had all of her work done before she went on holidays. No one had to fill in for her. Nothing had to be approved while she was away. Never took more than 10 days of leave. For them, that sounded like a model employee. For me, and I acknowledge I'm a somewhat suspicious individual, it immediately set up red flags of who on earth gets all their work done, never leaves anything for anyone else, never gets anyone to check their work. Yeah, so once diving in starts and once looking at this starts, particularly this, very quickly proven that $3 million US has been defrauded from the company over the past 20 years by the generation of fake vendors whose bank accounts linked back to hers, which we will come back to shortly, but the first red flag beyond behavioural in the data was the fact that many of those invoices were going in on weekends or after midnight. So she'd go home, she'd log back in, and she'd submit all her fake vendor invoices. She'd come in on the Saturday or Sunday and submit all her fake vendor invoices. It's a really interesting example of where none of that had come up. It hadn't come up in audits, it hadn't been picked up in reviews, it hadn't been picked up by management. It really hadn't even been picked up by a couple of conversations with her about some more minor concerns that had happened. How it came up was data analytics. So there are certainly somewhat limited ways of getting money out of a company, and data analytics helps us narrow those down. Scenario modeling this is around a matter involving funeral parlors in South Africa. And actually quite an interesting one. Specifically from the perspective that what is happening in this situation is a criminal group using these parlors is generating life insurance policies for people who are dead. You would normally think that would preclude you from life insurance, kind of a bit late at that point. But they were doing it in such a manner that they would get these policies and then cash in on them. Now, how was that detected? Well, in part, by realizing that many, laser pointer doesn't work there, many of the clients, different people with the policies, were linked back to the same phone numbers. If you look down on the bottom left, you'll see that in one case, 62 of these phone numbers were linked to different individuals. Now, that is either a really unlucky family or it's fraud. In this case, it's fraud. You can also see via mapping out the parlors against where these policies were being taken out, able to show the clustering of where these policies come through. And that gives you a sense, certainly as an investigator, but also as the client, of where are the biggest problems for the organization in the country? Where are you seeing most of this conduct and behavior? A similar kind of geographical mapping was done by us for a technology firm, where they had a problem of suspicious returns, suspicious spikes in returns through certain offices. What they subsequently came to realize was that there had actually been an organized effort to acquire products and return them into a different market where they actually got a larger financial benefit from returning it in that other market. Kind of fascinating. Seemed a lot more effort than actual return involved, but that's all right. I credit to them, it was a very intelligent fraud. But again, how it really was kind of demonstrated to the executives was getting it onto a map where they could suddenly say, there's like 10 stores in our global network of many that this is happening at. Why is that? And again, then able to link it back to collusion and misconduct and take those investigations, those extra steps to show the how of what is occurring. So really kind of interesting, not the most complicated thing in the world, but immediately delivering that extra value on what does this mean for an employee, an organization going through a problematic situation. Shared bank accounts, and this is starting to look at some of the, in this case, the hypothesis testing, looking at what we expect to see and then what we do see. And so in this case, one of the issues was that we started to see huge numbers of payments coming out, or large volume transactions coming out from a relatively small pool of individuals, more so than we expected to see in this particular sample of data. Does that immediately mean a problem? No, not necessarily, but it's showing the areas that we need to start diving further into, which brings us to the point around big data and the fact we're creating so much information. As investigators, and particularly as consultants who do investigations, clients don't really want us to be there for the rest of our lives. Otherwise, they make us employees, I presume. What this helps us do is really narrow down quickly those red flags. What needs to be looked at the highest priority? How do we look at it? And how can we quickly get to some answers on whether it is a problem, is not a problem? So immediately that helps you narrow that down. Why are we seeing more red flags in one spot than another? And that brings us to a point, and I'm going to be completely honest up front in a data analytics conference. I'm not very good at statistics. So this has come actually from my technical team. But one of the things they look at is Benfords law, which, as has been explained to me, is that the first digit should appear a certain number of times in any particular set of data. From the nods in the audience, I think I just got that right, which is excellent in a room full of statisticians. This is actually a really helpful way to detect fraud because of the fact that anyone, no matter how good you are at creating fraudulent invoices, at creating fraudulent vendors, at some point you are defrauding the or you're altering the normal flow and perspective of data, and you are going to cause a spike somewhere. That's just the case. That's just all it is. Until such time as AI is helping criminals to plan out how they do this, they're going to be skewing the data. And I'd like to draw attention particularly to the 5.9, because we're going to look at that in a moment. You will see it sits quite high above the curve. So it is 5.9 is occurring much more than we would expect to see it occur in the sample set of data. Obviously, there are a few others there, but I come to this again in a moment. So when they looked at this for a client, they said, okay, here are your 6 main variances, your 6 key areas to look into. Let's look at 5.9. And immediately, well, not immediately, but after diving into 5.9, there are 5 transactions for $5,900 that have the correct payment ID. There are 2 that have the wrong payment ID. There's 150 with no payment ID. 150 transactions that, and again, need to be looked at in more detail to ascertain whether or not there is fraud involved, but in which the proof at the top level, the proof of payment, service, etc., for this matter, were not available. And so straight away, that use of statistics actually helped to narrow down those red flags to make the investigation more targeted. If I'd known this 20-something years ago, I might have paid more attention at statistics in first-year university. This is the one that probably, for me, has yielded the most results over the years. And this is that where you start to marry those different data sets within your organization that contain data about your employees and your vendors that helps you pin down issues such as ghost employees or false vendors or vendor collusion. I've seen this in just about every jurisdiction I've worked in to some extent or another. The fundamentals, and I guess it's one of the fundamentals of fraud full stop, it can differ what you're using it for in different markets. What you do with the money, it may be embezzled or it may be paid to government officials, but the fundamentals of how you do it goes back to my point before of there are a limited number of ways to get funds out of most companies. And so in this instance, I've seen this now, so I've been based in Sydney, China, and India. I've been working in most jurisdictions in the Asia Pacific, and I've seen ghost employees turn up in every one of those markets. So an employee registers another employee into the system, often sharing a common account, which you detect once you start to bring together your payroll data and your employee data to see those commonalities between them. Now, I have seen at least one instance where this wasn't a problem. It was a known husband and wife, pair of employees in an organization, not an issue. In a particular matter I saw in China, though, I found 5 employees with completely different names, no known links to each other, because 4 of them didn't actually exist, all paying into one bank account. So immediately they were able to find out that this particular payroll employee, in collusion with another employee in finance, had registered a number of fraudulent employees for the purposes of getting money paid to them. Elegantly simple, really straightforward. The manager who had actually signed off above them on the employments hadn't thought anything of it. 2 trusted finance employees came to him and said they'd employed some more people. When it was said to him, look, did you not think it was a bit strange that in a relatively small department you suddenly had 4 employees you never met or anything like that? No, it hadn't entered the mind. It sounds stupid in a sense, but it's also understandable given that that man was very busy. He had a range of responsibilities across a range of departments. It was taking advantage of that to get these through. The other one then being vendor collusion, and something we've seen with procurement departments, is this sort of situation. And here you can see that the commonality becomes the phone number between the vendor and the employee. And the collusion here being that you have, so it's not necessarily false people, you have the employee number 1 who's got this phone number, his next of kin, or her next of kin, is the director of this ghost supplier. His line manager is the owner of the bank account that goes to the company. And so immediately you have that internal collusion between employees to commit fraud. It is something we've seen now, again, across many jurisdictions, that once you get a group engaged in, or once you find these types of frauds, you sometimes unravel them, and often unravel them, to more than one person. Some of them are too difficult to execute on your own, unless you have all of the approvals, as one company found out when they realized that their HR person was also the administrator of all their IT and payment systems. That was an interesting discovery for them. But you do find this situation of collusion between employees that is much easier to then detect through this data, yeah? I guess, I mean, those are the case studies I was going to go through at a high level. As I say, I wanted to focus more on telling you stories, because frankly, I think it's more interesting in at this moment in the conference, especially just before lunch. But does anyone have any questions before I get between you guys and the food? Two back here. Do you want to start?
Yeah, so just wanted to ask that which tools you have used while doing data analysis and data insight?
The tools that have been used have changed over the years. Some of these have been as basic as just Excel and pivot tables. Very straightforward, and then for visualization, exported to I2, manipulated in there and then presented. These days, as the data gets more and more complicated, it might involve, say, SQL databases into Tableau for the visualization. We've used Nuix. So we're relatively tool agnostic. We will use the tools that are right for the job. And that's actually constantly evolving. So we actually are analyzing new tools all the